When is the best time to spray insecticide on apples to prevent worms? This is a short edition of this lesson intended as a review for people who are already somewhat familiar with the topic. What are our learning objectives? After listening to this presentation, you should know how pheromone traps are used to determine when flight of codling moth begins, how to choose one date as the biofix based on traps, and how to use degree days to determine the best date after biofix to spray insecticide to control codling moth. Our target pest is codling moth, which is a key caterpillar pest in apple fruit. Shown here are pictures of its damage and the larva that causes the damage and the adult moth. Injury by codling moth is usually fairly obvious, as shown in the pictures in the middle, with a hole and a plug of frass, but sometimes the damage is much more subtle, just a small hole and no frass, but inside there is a tunnel and a worm. Here's the life cycle of codling moth. The objective of codling moth management is to prevent the young larva from entering the fruit. So we're very focused on this stage when the eggs are hatching and that tiny little larva is trying to enter the fruit. So what is the best insecticide timing for codling moth? There is a calendar approach, is spray every 2 weeks from petal fall until harvest, which is at least 10 sprays, or the integrated pest management approach is to use 2 or 3 sprays for each of 2 generations, the first spray at first egg hatch and the second spray 14 days later. So we're going to focus on how you determine when the first eggs are hatching. The eggs are very small and almost transparent, as shown in the picture on the right. So when do codling moth eggs begin to hatch? We know that's roughly 2 to 3 weeks after the moths begin to fly, and more precisely 250 degree days, base 50, after moths begin sustained flight. So we will discuss how that is determined. The knowledge needed falls into 4 parts: how to use traps, what is biofix, how to use degree days, and then when is the best date to spray. So part 1, how to use traps. Traps for codling moth come in different types, several styles of sticky trap and several styles of bucket trap. They all use a pheromone lure that is attractive only to codling moth. We recommend 3 traps per orchard block. And there's a lot more information about using traps in other modules that I won't go into here. So checking traps for codling moth, they should be set up at bloom, and they can be checked once per week for most of the summer, but strongly recommended to check these every 1 to 2 days from bloom until first sustained flight. To check them, you have to pull out the sticky panel of a sticky trap or look at the bottom of a bucket trap, looking for the target moths as shown circled here in red. And then sustained flight is when most of the traps are catching 1 or more moths per night. Part 2, what is biofix? Biofix is the date that sustained flight begins. So we're going to ignore any extra early trap moths, and I'll show you examples of what we mean by that. When in doubt, I think it's better to be conservative and call biofix early rather than waiting and calling it too late. So we'll look at 4 examples. Here's one example when in this year we set the traps out on the 29th of April, 3 different traps. This column in gray shows the number of days since the previous check. So you can see we waited 1 day, and then 3 days. They were all zeros. And then we had the first catch on the 5th of May in 2 of the traps, still followed by zeros. And then on the 10th of May, we had 601. I called that the biofix date. Here is another year, similar setup, 3 different traps, set up on the 27th of April, but they were all zeros until the 11th of May, first catch, and I called biofix the following day on the 12th of May. A third example, set up the traps on the 1st of May. We had first catch on the 4th of May, but I ignored that. Then we had just a smattering of moths over the next week. I decided to call biofix on the 9th of May when there were 2 and 5 and 4. A final example, this year there were only 2 traps out, and we had first catch on May 13th. I called biofix the next day on May 14th. What is the typical biofix date for codling moth? In a research orchard I've had for 18 years in Columbus, Ohio, the earliest biofix was April 20th, and the latest biofix was May 17th. Our average biofix for codling moth in this orchard has been May 8th. Part 3, how to use degree days. What are degree days? For 1 day, degree days is the average temperature minus a threshold temperature. Also, that threshold can be known as a base temperature. And then you can accumulate these over consecutive days. How do you find degree days? From a lookup chart or a simple calculation, as I will show here, or from an app on a smartphone or crop monitor. So a degree day chart shows the day's low temperature across the top, the day's high temperature down the side. So let's zoom in on one corner of this chart. For an example, if the low was 52 up here and the high temperature was 62 down here, you look at where those two intersect and it's 7. So your degree day total for that day was 7. If you have no chart, you can do a simple calculation. For example, with codling moth, the base temperature is 50. So on that one day, a high of 62, a low of 52, your average was 57. You subtract 50 from the 57, so you got 7 degree days. So your cumulative on that first day is 7. The next day, you had 8 degree days. Add that to the 7, you have 15. If you do that 2 more days, in this example, after 4 days, you had 34 degree days accumulated. Here's an example from my orchard where one column shows the degree days just for each individual day, and then the next column is the cumulative. So what you see circled in blue, we had a very small number of degree days per day during cooler weather, as circled in blue. We had a large number of degree days per day during hot weather, as shown in the days circled in red. Part 4, when is the best date to spray? How many degree days until spray time? That depends on which insecticide you plan to use. Most insecticides are best by the time that egg hatch begins, which is 250 degree days after Biofix, but some insecticides work best earlier. So here are the variations for different products. Degree days after Biofix of 250 which is approximately anywhere from first to second cover. That is recommended for the products Imidan, Avant, any of the pyrethroids, and any of the virus products. But then here are the other targets, 150 to 250 degree days for Alticor, Assail, Belay, Delegate, and Exarel, 100 to 200 for Confirm and Intrepid, and 50 to 75 for Dimilin and Ryman. The reason for that is Dimilin and Ryman work best if the pesticide goes on the leaf first and then the eggs are laid on top of that residue. So back to our example, here we had Biofix on the 9th of May. If we were applying Ryman or Dimilin, we were looking for 50 to 75 degree days, so that would have occurred on any of these dates between the 14th, 15th, 16th of May. If we were going to apply Confirm or Intrepid, we were looking for 100 to 200 degree days, so that would be anywhere between the 18th of May and the 22nd of May. Within this target period, if your weather looks suitable for spraying and your labor is good, it's probably better to go on the first day that you are in this ideal period and not risk waiting until later when the weather might be unsuitable for spraying. In this year, if we were targeting 100 to 250 degree days, those dates are circled in purple. If we were targeting 250 degree days, that is the 25th of May. So what about second generation codling moth? We need to re-biofix, and that is when there is a new surge in the moth catch observed. It's around anywhere from 1200 to 1500 degree days after that first biofix. In Columbus, that's usually around the second week of July. And then we start a new degree day count on that re-biofix date. In terms of the target for the individual insecticide products, it's exactly the same for second generation as for first, of down to 50 for Ryman, Dimilin, and up to 250 for Imidan. Here's an example in graph form. This graph shows the number of moths per trap per day. You could see we had our first generation, we ignored that first catch, we had our Biofix here, then we had moths going up and down through the first generation, but then they fell off right during the month of June. We detected one moth here that we ignored, and then this next point, we called that the re-biofix date. So then we were into second generation. Here's another example in the same format. So we had been through first generation. It had fallen off, not all the way to 0 here in June, but then we did detect a moth here. We ignored it, but then we re-biofixed when we were convinced that the new flight was beginning here. And then that was followed by catch a moths for quite a few weeks. So that's it. We're going to review our learning objectives. After listening to this, you should now know how pheromone traps are used to determine flight, how to choose one date as the biofix, and then how to use degree days to determine the best date after biofix to spray insecticide. That's the end. There are some related topics in other modules about things like using bloom time to predict events, more details on traps, and then how to use this concept of biofix and degree days for 2 other pests, that's oriental fruit moth and San Jose scale.